name is Michel Perreault. Thank you first, Xang, for the invitation. It's a real pleasure for me to share some of the research findings that we got. You see, I was involved in the first waves of the ZEPSOM study, and but since it was a longitudinal study, we kept, doing analysis, and it took a while before we got all these things together. And after the early stages, we were still working on some of the data. So we've been able to study some of these variables in more depth. I'll be presenting with Niamh, who was involved in the analysis of for some of these publications. So she'll be, we will share the time together. So the question theme for today is what have we learned on mental health well-being from the ZEPSOM cohort study? I'm sure that if Jean was here, Jean Caron, he would say that what I'll be presenting is probably something that is more based on a classical model of mental health illness, because we refer to distress and diagnosis. But it's true. But we still have findings that may be of interest to interpret in the context of a wellness model. And I would like to share maybe more the questions and the findings, and maybe we will have time to discuss some of them with you. But our presentation may elicit more questions than answers. And basically, that's what we're doing in research. Today, Niamh and I will look back on 5 publications to see in the spirit of this activity. And I really appreciate this occasion, because very often we do the research, we quickly publish, and we're up to something else. And I think it's really interesting to go back, as the title is suggesting, and try to see what we did and try to recontextualize that with the current work. So we were interested in many areas, but also in the and right now we're working on the issue of coping mechanisms at the work level, and we just published on the work-life balance context. Niamh will return to the results of 2 longitudinal studies to talk about the importance of coping and social support in the context of work and employment. And based on some of our findings in the ZEPSOM study, we're both involved on a study on sleep among health workers in this time of COVID. And so we're interested in stress, work, employment, and I would say the daily stress. So coping strategies is of interest. And I said to myself that it would be a good opportunity to review the results also on the psychotropic drug use, because the use of sleeping pills and psychotropic drugs that we did in the ZEPSOM study gave us some results that we could question, and we'll do that rapidly in this presentation. So first, I would like to invite Niamh to say a few words on the basic principles of coping strategies, because we'll go back to that. So it will take only 1 or 2 slides, but please, Niamh, can you just go on with that?
Absolutely. Thanks, Michel. I'm delighted to be here this morning with everybody. Thank you. So just a bit about coping. So we know that when confronted with stressors or difficult life events, such as mental and physical illness, that individuals cope in many different ways. And the way someone copes with their stressor and the level of psychological distress that they experience as a result is determined by a complex interaction of situational and psychological factors. One of the most important situational factors here is social support. That is someone's perception that assistance from other people is available to them and that one is part of a supportive social network. And we see that social support is associated with more adaptive coping behaviors. An influential psychological factor then in this coping process is someone's mental health status. For instance, depression has been associated with less adaptive coping behaviors. Now, within this process, there is an interchange between social support and mental health. For example, the mental health of economically disadvantaged populations is less stable from the outset. And not only does this predict more stress in these populations, but it also makes coping harder because poorer mental health also predicts deficits in the quality or quantity of social resources available to those people. And these deficits reduce the ability to cope effectively. And this in turn may lead to poorer mental health outcomes further down the line. So you can see it's kind of a circular effect. Then with regards to the typologies of coping, there are a number of different ways and many different frameworks that may be used to understand the different ways by which we cope. Taken together, you can identify two broad dimensions of coping strategies. The first set of coping strategies are characterized by a more direct and active confrontation of the stressor, often referred to as approach or problem-focused coping. And the second set of strategies are more passive and do not address the stressor quite as directly. This type of coping has been referred to as avoidant or emotion-focused coping, depending on the framework that you choose to use. This more passive type involves coping behaviors that will reduce emotional tension, such as smoking or eating more, drinking alcohol. So with that little bit of background, just a reminder on coping, I'll hand you back over to Michel, who's going to speak to you now about the use of psychotropic medication.
Thank you, Niamh. I think it's interesting what you just said about the typologies of coping, because we will come back to that later on, trying to explain what I'll be presenting. First, I'd like to give you, we'll go very quickly. We'll cover 5 studies. But we have the references, and some of them are old, but still the results are of interest. What I found really interesting in the contribution of the ZEPSOM study was to describe the population and variables that are there, but that we didn't really look into detail. And the exposure to psychotropic drugs, medication, I mean, is one of these interesting findings, because the use, if we look at the 5 classes of psychotropic medication, we have sleep, sedative, hypnotic medication, anti-anxiety like Ativan, Valium, Serax, mood stabilizer like lithium, Tegretol, FXR, antidepressant. I won't name everything, but antidepressant, antipsychotics, and stimulants. So, and we look at the use of these classes and the high exposition that we define like less in the use of 3 classes or more. And we look at different independent variables in the use of logistic regression that could predict the use of these different classes of medication. Can you go to the next slide, Niamh? Okay, first, look at the proportion of people who, from the sample who are utilizing every class. It's incredibly high, like sleep 10%, anti-anxiety 7.8, mood stabilizer 2.4, antidepressant 9, antipsychotics 2.3, stimulants. That we can do a lot with that because this sample size was small, so we didn't come up with significant predictors. But look at the results here that for each medication class, I won't go with the high exposure because it's similar result, but more specific predictors. But still, look at SEC was associated with sleep, anti-anxiety, and antidepressants. That we were expecting that. Age on almost all. Marital status to be single. Education, low education is, except for mood stabilizer, was associated. Low revenues, not being employed. So if you look at these variables that are associated with high exposure, you can see that most of these variables are also associated with low psychological well-being and also high level of distress. So there's something that is being covered by both concepts, but still there's some differences. And that's where I will go. Maybe if you can go to the next slide, Niamh. I have to be nice with her because she can decide just to cut some of my slides so you have more time at the end for her own section. So I'm in a really stressful situation at the moment, I have to say. So if you look at okay, determinant, maybe. Okay, we need to better understand the utilization of two of the most frequently used medication, sleep medication and antidepressant. If you looked at the different classes in the previous slide, you saw that it's around 10% for both. This is big. We're talking about the population now. So, so we did cluster analysis to find out about the different types of users of these drugs. So let's go to the next slide. So we did one study on the typology of sleep medication users. And we had 2 times, and we have a lot of information on that, but I'll go to the, let me just check that. Okay. If we take every types together, when we have the average age was 47 years, 62% were female, 27% were divorced, separated, or widowed, 39% had an income below 25,000. Majority of sleep medication users reported good physical health, almost 3/4 of them. However, a large proportion reported having low social support, 53%, and low quality of life, 60%. Among sleep medication users, 22% showed presence of a mood disorder within the past year, 10% had an anxiety disorder, and 52% showed elevated psychological distress. That's all together, but what is interesting is when we classify them into these clusters. We have one cluster where you have no mental health issues, another one with psychological distress and drug use, and mental disorders and multiple medication use. So I would say cluster 3 is a profile of people with mental health diagnosed problems. And those people used, and I don't know why, because I had some problems with my slides and I lost the proportions here. Let me just check if I have it. No. So because cluster 1 is something like 1/3, because it's a large proportion. So we have this group that is more of people with psychiatric disorders. The other one is more psychological distress and drug use. And these one, the third one, they were on at T1 and T2. The others here, they stopped between T1 and T2. And you see in red some of the, I would say, risk factors associated with the use of these medications. Look at the cluster number 1. You have no mental health issues, initiated use in the year preceding T2, so it's a longer period of use. They use it with supervision, older, living with a partner, higher income, good physical health, elevated social support, no reported mental health problem, no avoidance stress coping strategy. That's one of the typology. You see avoidance stress coping strategy in these last 2 clusters. So tendency to use alcohol, what are the other, I'm sorry, I don't use these coping strategies at all, so I cannot remember.
Smoking or alcohol use,
and
eating more.
So, but here, this is cluster 1 is really interesting because they may have sleep problems and they use that as prescribed. Or I have an hypothesis to share with you. Would it be possible that these people are not, because we're thinking of wellness as something that is like more than just the absence of symptoms, but maybe they're not fully satisfied with what they're going through, and they have sleep problems. And that would cover a gray area between having a diagnosis and well-being. You see, there's something here maybe that is missing. That's just an hypothesis. And I'll keep that in mind because we'll go to the another class. We'll go with antidepressant. Can you change slides? I just lost the screen.
Excuse me, I lost connection.
Just to, okay, so it's not me, it's her. So I'm so happy. Thank you, Niamh.
Are we back on track?
Yes, oh God, yes. So I'll try to go faster because
Your notes are up though, just so you know.
Yes, my note.
It's in presenter view.
Confidential, Niamh. Don't let people read my notes. So okay, so can you go to the next slide, Niamh, please?
Sorry.
Oh, I'm so happy I didn't do that because
I'm just going to reshare my screen just so that we're back on track.
I have to tell you that yesterday I lost my slides and I just had to do a complicated procedure to get them back, and I thought I was the only person having. Okay.
Do we see the notes now?
No.
That's fine.
This is perfect. Yeah.
Please, can you go to the slide where it says typology of antidepressant, that's it. Okay, so this one, and you see that between, you know, in the previous slides, I was talking the, you know, T1, T2, but it's a very, it's not only a few months, it's a year, or it's a long period. So here we did the same thing, but we did it with the antidepressant medication. I'll go faster. You can just go to the next one, Niamh. Okay, what we have here. Okay, antidepressant, it's really interesting because you know, if it's a medication, you should prescribe it for specific problems. What we see, we have 4 clusters there. And here we have people, cluster 1 with depression without anxiety, depression with substance use and polypharmacy, depression with polypharmacy and being treated by a psychiatrist. That's higher level. And then we have users without mental health disorders. Mind you that antidepressant should be used carefully. Here we have 28% of people who are using antidepressant who have no diagnosis. So here you can see that, let me just, okay. And here, no depression, no anxiety, no substance dependence, no prescription from a psychiatrist, no polypharmacy. Prescriptions from a general practitioner. And look at the risk factors. But they're living with a partner, they have high income, they have higher social support, they have low distress. So you know, what we would see, the other profiles, you'll find at least one risk factors. Like here you have higher income, living with a partner, but high distress. So you can see the profile. Here, not possible to see something that is distinctive. This I question, and I still have the question. I don't have the answer. That's why, you know, I'm expecting you to give me the answer before noon. I know, Xangfi, that you know it somewhere. We can hypothesize that this is maybe malpractice, and they received a prescription even if they didn't show the symptoms that would justify to use antidepressant. I discussed that with Serge Beaulieu, with a pharmacist from the CS, and nobody wants to go in that direction because it's not clear, because what is missing is dosages, and they can get antidepressants at low dosage for different purposes, even if it's not well supported in the literature. So one hypothesis would be, and that's supported in some studies, that these people wanted antidepressant. Medical doctors were under pressure to prescribe because they had to do something, and maybe people were insisting to get that. But if it's the case, maybe we have here something that would be covered with the wellness model that is not covered with this model of being ill or not ill, but maybe that they're not satisfied with their life, or they don't feel well, and it doesn't show in terms of distress or diagnosis. So that's my hypothesis. I think I will stop there with these questions. I like that as a researcher, to end with the question. And I'll ask Niamh to cover the other studies that on work.
Thanks, Michel. So this morning, I'll go as quick as I can because I know we're behind time, but I'd like to speak about mental health and coping within the context of work and employment. How I relate these topics to wellness is that mental health is a major aspect of wellness, as we know. And as well as that, my understanding of wellness involves good functioning, which would relate to coping. And I also see wellness to mean having a sense of purpose, and someone's employment status can often have an impact on this. Some background here, you may well be aware that there's a strong body of empirical evidence suggesting that being employed is a protective factor against mental health issues, and that being unemployed or underemployed is associated with poor psychological health. And the two studies which I'll present sought to further understand the psychological mechanisms which underlie these associations. So what's going on here that these associations are happening? The first study, published in 2016, sought to examine the roles of social support and coping strategies as mediators of the longitudinal association between employment status and mental health. The variables were measured at baseline and then 2 and 4 years after the initial survey, which you're aware of. Employment status was measured by asking participants to report the number of hours they worked in the last week for the past 12 months. Mental health here was measured using the variables psychological distress and major depression. So that's how mental health was measured. Social support measured using the social provision scale. With regard to coping then, avoiding coping that we repeatedly are talking about today was measured here. It was drawn from 3 different scales, including the coping strategies indicator, ways of coping revised, and the cope inventory. And participants indicated on a 4-item scale how often they were using one of the following avoidance strategies to cope with stress. Were they smoking more cigarettes than usual? Were they drinking alcohol? Were they using drugs or medication? Doing physical exercise, or were they eating more or less than usual? So there were 1,982 participants of the overall cohort that provided complete information. And in taking a fresh look at these results, it's been about 1.5 years since I was looking at these as well. Firstly, descriptive information about this sample indicated some potential differences in coping profiles. So when comparing those who were employed full-time to those who were unemployed, those working full-time reported significantly lower distress and depression, and they were using greater amount of coping with physical activity and alcohol. Those who were unemployed reported greater coping with the use of drugs and medication and cigarettes. So you can see differences already. Secondly, the results of this lovely complicated looking model using structural equation modeling were of interest. This analysis was employed in order to investigate the variables through which the relationship between employment status and mental health was taking place. So a combined group consisting of part-time workers and the unemployed were compared to another group of people working full-time. And the results revealed here that there was a negative association between full-time employment and depression, which was fully mediated by social support, less coping with drugs and medication, and less distress. And there was also a negative association between full-time employment and distress, which is partially mediated by increased social support, coping with alcohol, and less coping with drugs and medication. So what is this saying? It suggests that full-time employees generally have more resources and do not tend to use avoidance strategies like coping with drugs and medication, which then results in less depression and less distress for this population. The second study then briefly treated the subject of the association between employment status and mental health as well, but it was somewhat different in that it dealt with employment transitions as well. There's plenty of evidence to assert that becoming unemployed is a stressful experience. However, that's not to say that going from a situation of unemployment to employment is always straightforward. Both becoming unemployed and becoming employed, they're both transitional employment states, but there's not a lot of information on how individuals cope with these changes in employment status and what effect it has on their mental health. So the objective of this study was to look at that association, including transitional employment status, and see what's going on there, controlling for the effect of coping skills, social support, and stressful events. Employment status again was measured at 3 time points, and the nice longitudinal design enabled the identification of 6 mutually exclusive groups, and you can see them there. Basically, the first 2 were the unemployed and the employed, and then the last 4 groups there either went from being employed to being unemployed, or they went from being unemployed to employed at different time points. So it allowed us to compare all of those. And mental health was measured in the same way, and coping and social support were measured in the same way as the previous study. There are 1,168 participants of the overall cohort for this. And once more, taking a look at this descriptive information on the sample, there was an indication again of differences in coping profiles. We saw that the continually employed full-time workers reported more coping with alcohol, were younger in age, more educated, had more social support, and experienced less stressful events. The longitudinal linear regression analysis then compared these 6 employment status groups in terms of psychological distress over time. In the raw model, before controlling for social support and coping strategies, the continually unemployed, as well as all but one of the transitional employment status groups, had a significantly higher level of distress than the continually employed over time. Controlling for education in step 2, the model didn't change anything, but in step 3, the variables social support, number of stressful events, coping with alcohol, drugs, coping with cigarettes, and coping with change in eating behavior were entered into the model, and each of those demonstrated significant associations with psychological distress at time 3. Once these factors were controlled for, the associations did change, and no longer did any of the transitional employment status groups have a higher level of distress than the continuously employed over time. So these findings do indicate that some of the negative impact of unemployment or unstable transition employment can be alleviated by optimal levels of social support and less avoidant coping. The findings also provide further support for unemployment as a risk factor for poor mental health. So taken together, the results of these 2 studies on employment show how full-time or continuously employed status is associated with less avoidant coping behaviors, which has a subsequent positive impact on mental health. And we do see that it seems that the unemployed used more avoidant coping behaviors. This has a negative impact on mental health. And we know that unemployment and socioeconomic status are closely related. So these studies show how unstable employment and low socioeconomic status are associated with less adaptive coping and may render this population more vulnerable to mental health problems from the outset. So just to conclude, what do the findings of these 5 studies tell us about well-being, if we're focusing on well-being today? So first of all, the findings presented by Michel demonstrate that there are important differences in the profiles of people who use psychotropic medication. And considering these different profiles may help in better supporting individuals when using these medications to try and feel better. Second of all, the same findings highlighted that generally speaking, the level of psychotropic drug utilization was quite high. And it wasn't only those with diagnosed mental health conditions who were using these medications. And we know that since that data was collected, that there's been even more of an increase in the prescription and use of psychotropic medication across the board, which has been further compounded by the spike in psychotropic drug use during the COVID-19 pandemic. We saw that in a number of different cultural contexts, there was a surge in the use of antidepressants and sleep medications, particularly at the outbreak of the pandemic. So revisiting these findings today serves as a reminder, I suppose, to ask questions about the appropriate use of psychotropic medications and to question what the use of these medications is saying about the present state of well-being in the population. With regards to the studies on employment, they're consistent with previous studies that link social support and less avoidant coping to better mental health. Once again, the findings show how the employed are faring better than the unemployed, just adding to existing evidence asserting the relationship between unemployment and poor mental health. And we saw that the negative implications of unstable or changing employment situations can be alleviated when social support and adaptive coping is optimized. And that's important to consider when seeking to support and facilitate wellness and better functioning in the context of a post-COVID society, if I may say, especially just considering that many individuals have become unemployed or undergone changes or instability in their work situation throughout the pandemic. And as well as that, we saw throughout the pandemic there were stay-at-home orders, restrictions on social interactions. And again, with these findings, you see the importance of social support in eliciting better mental health outcomes and better coping. So I'll leave it there because I know we're running over time, but thank you very much for the opportunity to revisit these findings.